So I will just say, as I'm letting everybody in, that we've kept mics and cameras off for all of the attendees, just so it's more relaxing for you to dial in and watch and be involved in the webinar. So you can literally dial in from wherever you need to. We will have a chat function at the end, and so but if their question does pop up, obviously raise your hand if you want to interact, but also use the chat function, and then at the end of the session we will try our best to get to all of the questions and offer answers. There will be, yes, there will be minutes. We are recording the session, so I should share that with you all that are just jumping onto the call now. We had a few people that couldn't attend, so we said that we would record the session. If it's a success, we will maybe do this again, but I don't want to volunteer Andy's time. So he's obviously a busy chap, so if it's a success and lots of people get a lot out of this, it will be something that we will probably repeat, just to make sure everyone can get involved and to get all the information that they need. And obviously this at the moment is quite a dynamic situation, and as I understand it, things are changing on a semi-regular basis, so obviously more information will be coming out as time goes on. So Georgia, I'm going to leave it to you to admit people as they come in, if that's okay, and then I can just focus on sharing my attention with everybody. So as we're just coming up to 5 past the hour, I'm just going to take this moment to say thank you all very much for getting involved in this webinar. Just to give you some background, we did an open day at EVM, and Andy came along and took over one of our rooms and had some like one-to-one sessions with people about PSVAIR and PSVAIR. And obviously you found them to be very valuable. There's a lot of questions, and so we found them to be really valuable, and we thought, having met people on the day, we thought, wow, this is a big topic and there's so much legislation and policy that people have to navigate in this industry, and it'd be really great if we can try and make this scalable. So use the context that we have to organise a session where Andy can basically explain everything he knows and all the advice that he has to the maximum amount of people. And so that's why we have the session. So literally I'm just here to kind of facilitate and organise the meeting. So I'm going to hand over to Andy shortly, but just to introduce myself, I'm Alex O'Loughlin. I am the marketing manager for EVM UK and Ireland, and I'm joined by Georgia Slade, who is my marketing executive in our team. Just give us a wave, Georgia. And of course Andy from RHA. I will just quickly say as well that if there is a fire alarm in our building, although you're not with us, we will probably need to vacate the building. So Andy and I have sorted it between us that if either one of us have that issue, hopefully the other one can take over the presentation, although I am in no way an expert, so I will just be like reading off of his slides. So hopefully that won't happen today, but you know, dramatic things do happen, especially nowadays. And yeah, just thank you all for registering and for being here. And without further ado, I'm just going to hand you over to Andy and put myself on mute so I don't cause any disruption.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I'm just going to put the presentation up. I'm hoping everybody can now see. Firstly, good morning to you all. I'm Andy Warrender, Operations Manager for Coaches at RHA. Firstly, thanks to Alex and the team at EVM for the invitation to participate in this session. Hopefully it will prove useful for you all. The main aim is to kind of simplify the accessibility regs and what they mean on a practical basis for you as bus and coach operators, and hopefully to highlight some of the key areas that you might need to pay attention to in particular. I'm not going to get into too much detail with this, otherwise you'd all fall asleep and we'll be here forever. So it's very much a kind of broad overview of PSVAR and PSVAIR as it currently affects the industry. Certainly been the topics of conversation over the course of the last few months, and indeed for a lot longer. So, give a bit of background. PSVAR, PSVAIR were regulations which came into play with the intention of making public transport in particular more accessible to a wider audience. and particularly those with impaired mobility or other sight or hearing deficiencies that might limit their access to travel normally. The intention was to remove discrimination from these groups and to promote greater inclusivity by allowing them to access the same level of service on the same vehicles and services as their peers. Starting firstly with PSVAR. Most people in the industry are aware of these regs. They've been around for some significant number of years now, 20 odd years in the case of PSVAR. There's often mixed views of what they actually mean for operators, and certainly having had discussions in recent months, there's the people who've asked for a bit more of a broader overview as to where their business sits and what services are included, what exemptions are in place, what vehicles are included, and what features they actually require. So we'll go through this basically on a Q&A type arrangement with some of the more common questions that we've been asked. Passenger Service Vehicle Accessibility Regs 2000, they can trace their origins back to the Transport Act in 1985, which set out the deregulation of local bus services. One thing it also did was introduce the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, or DIPTAC as it was more commonly known. The committee's role was to advise the government on policy that would make public transport more accessible to disabled people. Subsequently, in 1995, the Disability Discrimination Act came into play, which gave greater force to removing discrimination against disabled people. And for transport, ultimately resulted in PSVAR coming into play in 2000. Whilst DDA was succeeded by the Equality Act in 2010, nothing really changed as far as PSVAR was concerned, but it did have a stronger underpinning in the shape of the new Act, which reinforced the aims of DDA, but it took it a step further by imposing a requirement to take all reasonable steps to accommodate disabilities. And that was across a wide range of different areas, not just transport by any means. So what does PSVAR actually require? Well, in summary, it requires vehicles used on in-scope services, and I'll come back to that shortly, to incorporate features to a specific standard which would allow access to passengers with a wider range of disabilities. Now, typically these include access for wheelchairs, fairly well known, that one relatively commonly recognised, destination display standards, given height, and also content that was more expansive. Things like entrance door widths, heights, handrail locations, contrasting colours for the benefit of those with visibility impairments, step heights, tread depths and visibility of those steps, the typical contrasting colours to the edges of steps to make them again more noticeable for those with sight impairment. Provision of priority seating is one that's often forgot. It sets specific cushion heights, depths, leg room in front of the seats, etc. Again, to make those seats more accessible, and generally they're the seats that are at the front of the vehicle or immediately behind the wheelchair bay in case of a lot of buses. The signage of facilities around the wheelchair and priority seating were given their own standards, and also critically devices allowing disabled passengers to communicate with the drivers. Basically, it's a bell push, but having that within reach of disabled passengers, either in the priority seats or in the wheelchair bays, was something that was deemed to be important. Now, which services are in scope of PSVAR? This is something that comes up all too often. The technical bits of what's required are all relatively straightforward, but what's less so are the range of services to which PSVAR applies, which services are in scope, which services are out of scope. Now, the definitions of services in scope are contained in the regs themselves, and most of these refer to definitions contained in previous acts, notably the Passenger Service Vehicles Act 1981 and the Transport Act 1985. It can be broadly explained as a regular service which runs along a specified route, specified times, i.e. it runs to a timetable, and on which passengers pay an individual fare. More on that later. If it meets those criteria, it would generally be regarded as in scope of PSVAR. I will stress this is general operational advice, it's not legal advice, and if you're in any doubt, you should consult a legal authority according to particular conditions of your own business. So the services that are in scope, typically this would include, but wouldn't be exclusive to, local bus services. That's the most common one by far. That's where the emphasis was to start with, and certainly there's no real argument about that one. Express coach services, again, they were brought into scope at a relatively early stage, although again the vehicles came in after low floor buses. There was a short exemption period for wheelchair access on vehicles for 5 years. Home to school journeys, this is where it started to get interesting, because an awful lot of school journeys were overlooked, and there's a strong argument that says that home to school journeys were never intended to be included in the first place. The emphasis was always on local bus services, but nonetheless, given the definitions of service and the descriptions that apply, home to school is very much in there. Probably the most contentious, and undoubtedly the one that caught the industry both on the supply side and on the regulatory side on the hop, were rail replacement. It wasn't until 2018, I think it was, that legal opinion finally came down on the side that rail replacement services were included in PSVAR requirements. So I mentioned about a separate or an individual fare. Basically, a fare is payment to travel on a PSV. The traditional view of a cash fare paid on a bus, not quite extinct yet, and is the most obvious one, but it would also include multi-ride tickets or period tickets, season tickets, term tickets, that sort of thing. One that isn't always obvious to operators, and it's certainly been raised many times in the past, and it's one that could catch people out, is where the fare is collected by a third party. For instance, is it an element of school fees, or for staff transport, is it a deduction from pay? Now, the legal advice some years ago with this was that any contribution made by a passenger could be regarded as being a fare paid. If that allowed them to travel on a service, then it would be classed as an individual fare. In the case of schools, if it was collected again as an element of school fees, and particularly if those using the service paid more than those who didn't use the service, then it was clear that that difference was an element that was provided purely for them for transport and to allow them to travel on the service. Regular services not in scope, well, actually a fair few. In truth, it's most services. Any service which didn't apply or have the conditions that noted above that didn't apply to them, if any one of those fell out, if it didn't operate to a specific timetable, if a fare wasn't paid, etc., then it would fall out. The curious one with this is perhaps home to school journeys where no fares are paid. Now, this is something that kind of flies in the face of this being legislation based on inclusivity, because it actually discriminates against those who don't pay and who are less entitled to facilities than those who do. Something that's often been sort of mooted as evidence that home to school journeys were never intended to be included in this, because if they had been, then they would have specifically had to have said that in the original PSVAR, and there's no mention of it at all. So, compliant vehicles. This could include a vehicle designed to carry more than 22 passengers. 22 passengers is the cut-off point. 23 and above are in scope of PSVAR. Now, the requirements and the specific specifications for this can be found in Schedules 1, 2 and 3 of the PSVAR themselves. Schedule 1 is a common baseline. It applies to all compliant vehicles, and depending on the vehicle type, then either Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 will apply. Schedule 2 applies for single and double deck buses, essentially low floor vehicles to which have got roll-on access for wheelchairs, whereas Schedule 3 is specific to coaches, vehicles with no standees, certified as a coach or type approved as one. If you need to know more detail on that, then the slides for this will be circulated afterwards. You can click on the links and see the exact detail in the relevant sections of the PSVAR 2000 regs. So what's an exempted vehicle? Typically a vehicle with 22 passengers or less, as we've mentioned. A vehicle used for the secure carriage of persons, basically that's prison type vehicles. Interesting one, any vehicle more than 20 years old on the day it's used, on the day that it's used, i.e. if it's used on a day this year and it's more than 20 years old on that day, then it can be used. However, there is a limit that it can't be used on more than 20 days in any one calendar year. on in-scope services. You can use it on out-of-scope services, but if it's used on in-scope services, 20 days a year is the maximum. It's an interesting one, and certainly I've seen it used in the past to cover specifically for compliant vehicles being out of service for any reason. Allows provision for historic vehicles on seasonal services, for instance, as well. Ambulances or other vehicles used for conveying the sick or injured persons kind of makes sense. Vehicles operated by or under the instruction of a Minister of the Crown, predominantly military vehicles. They're worth noting that the coaches that are now entering service for the UK military are prepared for accessibility. They're not equipped for it, but they are prepared for it. No doubt with an eye on future use once those vehicles are demobilised and go into Civvy Street. Highly contentious one amongst O licence holders is vehicles operated under a Section 19 permit. Though perhaps worth mentioning that a lot of those vehicles are accessible and would meet most of the requirements in their basic form anyway. And then finally, a vehicle operated under an MTE2 exemption. What's that, I can hear you ask? MTE2 is the latest round of exemptions issued to operators for home to school journeys. They followed on from the original MTE exemptions, which expired on the 31st of July this year. Now, this second round applies to home to school journeys only. It's something that has proved to be something of an issue over the course of the last few weeks, largely because of the timescales that were applied to it, which didn't allow any room for error, but I'll come back to that again. These only apply to home to school journeys with fare paying passengers. Those that hold these exemptions can undertake home to school journeys with non-compliant vehicles that are registered and have a relevant certificate until the 31st of July 2030. So it's essentially a 4-year period, but it is subject to them complying with the conditions under which they were issued. Now, these conditions are quite extensive. 4 basic conditions, but they cover quite a lot of ground. The first one is maintaining minimum fleet compliance. Those with exemptions issued will have a specific proportion of their fleet that was compliant, and they must maintain that proportion. If the fleets gets bigger, they still must maintain, for instance, if it's 25% or 30%, they must maintain that going forward. DVSA will have calculated this on the basis of the information that operators provided, and it will be noted on the exemption that's been issued to them. There is also a register of this, which I'll add the link to, so if anybody's in any doubt, they can check who's got relevant exemptions and what proportion of their fleet exempts, etc. Second one, a PSVAR coach must be provided on request. If a PSVAR vehicle is required, i.e. if somebody in a wheelchair requires it, or if there's another reason for that, then the operator is obliged to provide one for that particular service within 2 months of the request. During this time, if the operator is expected to engage with the local authority or whoever's issuing the contract, in order to ensure that alternative accessible transport is available until such time as they can meet their obligations on that. They're also obliged to provide this at no additional cost. Now, that's something that might seem fairly straightforward, but it's something that operators really should be considering when you're pricing school contracts up. If at some point along the line that particular contract required an accessible vehicle, what would that mean in terms of your cost base and your ability to be able to provide it? Now, this third one is something that is particularly disappointing as far as the industry is concerned, in that any operator who's been issued with an exemption, if they buy new vehicles, and it doesn't specifically have to be for home to school journeys, the mandate is that the operator has to buy at the very least vehicles which are prepared for accessibility, i.e. it has to have the basic structure prepared for conversion at a later date, which could, for instance, include the access door, arrangements for mounting the lift, the destination, etc. Something that's available from most of the manufacturers now. But nonetheless, it may be something that the operator didn't have in mind. If that vehicle, for instance, is going to be used on tours, then that's something that they need to take into account. Now, there is an exception to this if the vehicle is regarded as being for specialist touring. The original guidance on this gave examples of band buses and high-spec corporate or sporting transport type vehicles, typically the type of thing that Premiership football clubs might be using. But DFT have confirmed now that this could be a wider range of vehicles, providing that the vehicle meets the key requirements of it has a non-standard layout. It's not a standard coach layout. It has at least 20% fewer seats than the conventional layout. So typically, if it was normally a 50-seater vehicle, then it would be down to at least or no more than 40 seats. And that it also must include kitchen facilities. And there's been a bit of debate over what might include kitchen facilities, but generally it's cooking for facilities as a minimum, reheating food. Condition 4, you are obliged to provide accurate data on your full fleet at any point in time during the course of the exemptions. Now, failure to comply with any of them to terminate the exemptions with immediate effect. So you would then be expected to be fully compliant on any home to school journeys that you were operating. You would have to operate with compliant vehicles or vehicles that weren't exempt under MTE2, sorry. Rail replacement. Again, this has been quite a contentious one, particularly since the ministers wrote to the rail replacement aggregators, those who procure rail replacement services, back in January. It's resonated many times over the past few years and probably grown louder over the past few months since that letter was sent. All rail replacement exemptions for PSVAR ended on the 31st of July. So basically, from that date, all vehicles must be compliant with PSVAR unless they're either out of scope or exempted by the specific exemptions that we mentioned earlier. It's unlikely many of those would apply. Smaller vehicles, potentially yes, where they were being used, particularly if it was getting into areas where there's restricted access for larger vehicles. It must be stressed, the MTE2 exemptions that we spoke of earlier, they are specific to home to school journeys. They do not apply to rail replacement. So moving on, that covers PSVAR. What about PSVAIR? Again, the questions that were asked: what is it? What services does it cover? What vehicles are in scope? What exemptions are there to it, etc. So dealing with the first, what is PSVAIR? It's commonly referred to as PSVAIR, largely because it's a bit of a mouthful to give it its full designation, and it helps remove some of the confusion with PSVAIR. It's not the same as PSVAR. It is related to it, but the rules are different. Like PSVAR, it was intended to further the cause of inclusivity by making public transport more accessible, particularly for disabled travellers and those with specific impairments. What does PSVAIR require? In summary, vehicles, broadly speaking, it introduces a new range of features to vehicles, which makes it more practical for sight and hearing impaired passengers. And to be fair, it also has significant benefits for all passengers, particularly if they're travelling in unfamiliar territory. It requires for journey information to be provided both visually on screens and also audibly via conventional audio delivery, and also through induction audio systems which are linked to hearing aids. Services in scope of PSVAIR, these again are different to those for PSVAR. Those that are in scope are as defined in the Transport Act 1985 section 2. Broadly speaking, services with stopping points less than 15 miles apart, where all the points en route are less than 15 miles distant. Where passengers are taken up, set down at predetermined points. Where passengers are picked up and set down at predetermined points, i.e. particular bus stops, stations, etc. And where our old friend, the separate fare, is paid to travel. Same rules apply to separate fares. So to revisit, just to recap the separate fare, the criteria would be exactly the same as it is for PSVAR. It could be a fare paid on the vehicle, it could be a period or a multi-journey ticket, charge made for school fees, or indeed a deduction from pay. The range of services not in scope is broader than for PSVAR. There are more of them, but it is slightly more confusing. Any services where the stops are more than 15 miles apart, i.e. it's not generally regarded as a local service. That could be a long distance service or even a longer rail replacement service. Closed door schools are specifically exempt, regardless of whether or not there's fare paying passengers on there. Again, there's a historic vehicle exemption, but it's not 20 years. Any service operated by a vehicle first used to provide a local service before the 1st of August 1973. So who knows, route masters could be on the way back for rail replacement. Typical tours, day trips, private hire, the sort of non-regular trips, they're all excluded. The contentious one again for Section 19 permit holders. And perhaps the most significant one from a vehicle point of view, it includes all vehicles with a capacity of 17 passengers or more. Remember, PSVAR, it doesn't kick in until you get to 23 passengers. So a lot more vehicles included with PSVAIR than are for PSVAR. General exemptions, journeys operated by vehicles registered prior to the 1st of October 2014, but this does expire fairly soon on September the 30th. This is part of the arrangements for phasing PSVAIR in, again, graduated against the particular vehicle age. As I say, that one expires in September. There's a further exemption, journeys operated, more recent addition to exemptions is for non-planned rail replacement, but this applies currently, and I will say currently, only to coaches. That exempts them from it for non-planned rail replacement, i.e. emergency cover, until it's actually the end of January, beginning of February in 2027. Probably the strangest one, journeys where the portion of the route length with stops less than 15 miles apart is less than 15% of the total journey distance. That all sounds a bit of a mouthful, but for instance, if you've got a service that has 3 or 4 stops at the very beginning of it, then doesn't stop for 200 miles, providing those 4 stops within a distance that's less than 50% of the 100 or 200 mile route, then the route would be exempt. That would apply also to rail replacement on a similar nature, but I will say that there seems to be a general expectation from those procuring rail services that those services will still be expected to comply, so they would still expect compliant vehicles. Is there any money available to help? There's currently grants available for PSVAIR equipment for coaches only. These offer up to £2,000 per unit and are provided on a refund basis, i.e. the applicants must have paid for the systems up front, received them for use before they can then apply for apply for the grant funding. Qualification criteria depends on whether you've been previously involved in rail replacement or whether this is a completely new line of work for you. Both qualify for grants. The level and the quantity of grant that's available is different for both. Full details are available on the government website. If it is something that you are interested in doing, if you haven't yet applied, then worth familiarising yourself on what could be available. What's our position as a trade body? Well, our HA has been led by members entirely on our policy approach to accessibility. There is no going back on accessibility. It's here to stay and it will extend as we go forward. But what we do really need is an approach that's both efficient and practical in its application. And we're fairly clear on where we see this to be. Our emphasis is very much looking beyond the current focus, which is solely on the operator and indeed the vehicle. We know that even 100% accessibility on every vehicle wouldn't result in every journey being accessible. There are too many other elements that get in the way, and more often than not, it is down to infrastructure and being able for passengers to board individual vehicles. And that's more so in the case of coaches, purely on account of the additional space that's required to deploy lifts, etc. Getting to the point of boarding is usually an issue in itself. Even if that point is suitable for boarding a coach, it doesn't necessarily mean that the same provision will be available at the end of it. So more emphasis needs to be given to provide infrastructure and to give operators and passengers some surety. And we've seen relatively recent introductions of terminals, of schools, who make no provision at all for accessibility on coaches. The current arrangement for wheelchair access, to be fair, has been with us for some 60 to 70 years. During that time, coaches have changed dramatically. They've got bigger, they've got taller. What's needed now really is an arrangement that provides easier access and greater dignity for passengers. It needs something that is easier to use, that doesn't require so much space. And I think most people who, take a rational look at this agree that it's time now for a more inclusive approach to this. Where there's demand, accessibility should be provided. There is no doubt about that. But what I would also say, in my many years in coaches, I've never come across a case where the industry, an operator, whoever, has failed in this respect. If accessibility has been required, the vehicles have been made available, but all too often other factors, and as I say, it's frequently the infrastructure failings, have prevented that journey being accessible. There has to be a mandated commitment from operators, but I think that's already there, and largely the principles of the 2010 Equality Act and the underlying foundations of PSVAR, and indeed the requirements of the latest MTE2 exemptions for home to school, more or less apply that, so it's nothing new. Accessibility should be, as we've said, available where it's demanded, and this would vary according to the typical service being provided. But it's fair to say, I think, that there will be a wider scope of inclusivity for accessible journeys in the future. In the case of a local service where passengers would typically turn up and go, accessibility has to be available at that point. So if they go to the bus stop or the coach stop, and it's normally a service they would get on, then that service has to be available to them as soon as the vehicle pulls up. For other services, the needs of customers are known in advance. The demand can be made at an earlier stage when they book a ticket in advance for an express service, or indeed with our old friend, the home to school journey. The needs of passengers are known well in advance of the vehicle turning up, so that can be accommodated. And that's the point at which the specific needs should be made known. And that's something we feel very, very strongly about. It's also backed up with the general thinking on the MTE2 exemptions that are currently in place, which recognise that home to school journeys, in the vast majority of cases, are more informed as to what the specific passenger requirements are. As I've said, the current thinking, we do believe, is deeply flawed and is placing a disproportionate level of responsibility on coach operators, who may have to provide a fully compliant vehicle for an in-scope service. But in truth, if it's a coach, there's a fair chance that that passenger may never be able to board that vehicle. So along those particular lines, we see that as being something that's of particular significance. Just a reminder, this is specifically operational guidance. It is not legal advice. We're happy to answer any particular questions about your particular operation, but if you're in any doubt about how PSVAR or PSVAIR affects your particular circumstances of operation, then you should seek specialist legal advice on it. Finally, if you're interested in our approach to PSVAR, or indeed any aspect of our wider campaign on behalf of the coach sector, we've just published our latest policy document a couple of weeks ago, Coaching Ahead. It's available to download from the RHA website. As I say, the slides will be available, so you can use the links to access it. Thanks to Alex and the team at EVM for the opportunity this morning. Hopefully I've not confused you too much with the issues or bored you all to sleep. But if there are any who are still awake out there, I'm happy to take any questions either directly or indeed forward them to our email after the event.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. That was terrific. I learned loads and I've written articles on it, but I think understanding about the exemptions, I think it's still a little bit difficult to understand. So you have to kind of go on a vehicle by vehicle, fleet by fleet basis. But I think it's really interesting to know, especially the difference between the PSVAR, as in seating capacity, and that for the PSVAIR, which could have caught people out. So with that, has anybody, I haven't had any questions come in on the chat, but if anyone does have any questions, just going to give a minute or two for people to just type. As Andy said, he's happy to be approached after the session. If you have something that's more specific or in depth and you want to speak to him about it, you can reach out directly. Otherwise, please do feel free now to pose a question, and then there might be other people on this webinar who are less comfortable asking a question that might learn from your own situation. So yeah, just hang in that space for a moment, see if anybody sends in a question. And if for any reason your chat function's not working, just raise a hand and I can free you up to ask in person. Thank you. So let's go to this question. So question from Keith. Does the information have to be on a screen if a rail replacement is just running between two stations? Can it be a printed sign?
Generally, no. It has to be provided in what they call a timely fashion, I think off the top of my head, which would require that we're now approaching a particular station. We have now arrived at a particular station. So I don't think that I would need to look into that, to be perfectly honest. It's a good question. We tend to deal with routes that involve multiple stations and, varying distances. I don't think we've come across one that, specifically would operate just between two stations. Gut feeling is it probably wouldn't, but I'll be quite happy to look into it.
And brilliant. So the next question is from Paul. I run 16 and 22 seat minibuses on a school transport route. Does the PSVAIR apply?
If it's specifically school transport, then no. If it's school transport, it's a specific exemption from PSVAIR, but PSVAIR would come into play. However, given that the vehicles are all 22 seats or less, then they would be exempt.
I think some people can be a massive sigh of relief on that one. 8 to 16 seats seems to be the sweet spot. I can understand why they're popular models for people to be investing in. That's brilliant. Does anybody else have any more questions? So does it again? So does it mean from February emergency rail replacement will need stop announcements that would exclude many bus operators?
That's currently the case, and the exempt, in fact, they're excluded at the moment. The current exemption that's in place for 6 months only covers coaches. It's specific to all seated vehicles. So if you've got low floor service buses or anything like that where the standees are permitted, then they're not covered. They would have to be compliant at the moment. There is some question as to whether or not that particular requirement was an error or whether or not it was something that was deliberately put into play. The gut feeling, I think, again, amongst those that have been involved in it was probably an error, and that services buses should have been included in the exemption to allow them to continue for a further 6 months. There's certainly recognition that there's an awful lot of low floor vehicles out there that aren't yet equipped with it.
And what due diligence can operators undertake when selecting PSV? Oh, this is a good question. Well done, Luke. What due diligence can operators undertake when selecting PSVAIR equipment, particularly with new suppliers popping up on the market?
There's an awful lot going on in terms of activity in this particular sector. We wouldn't recommend any particular supplier. The operators themselves have to undertake the donkey work to make sure that what they're actually getting is going to satisfy their particular requirements and also meet the regulations. I will say that I've not seen one that doesn't actually meet the regulations yet, or I don't think so, but that's not to say that there aren't any out there. So you need to be able to satisfy yourselves in your own mind. In terms of the suppliers, there are an awful lot out there, and we've heard some concerning stories over the course of the last few weeks. So again, do the due diligence that you would with any new supplier, but above all, make sure that the equipment firstly satisfies your particular needs.
That's right. So there are, I think, a few companies that can do like retrofit solutions, which you can literally either install or adhere to like a windscreen, not windscreen, sorry, a window within the
Side
vehicle.
window.
And I think obviously a lot of people have been building them and getting them out into the market and struggling to meet demand. So I think, yeah, there is absolutely that question of there's quite a few people, but how do you know which one to choose? Thankfully, some people have already taken the risk and started getting things installed, so there hopefully will be people out there that can share their stories and reach out to them for any, I would say, any references or testimonies. You know, if you know of anyone that has actually had it installed, obviously reach out to them and see how they found it. From an EVM perspective, we like if you were to buy a vehicle and you'd stipulate we need it to be PSVAR, PSVAR and PSVAIR. We would do a feasibility assessment on the vehicle itself, because obviously not all of the vehicles the vehicles don't necessarily have PSVAIR. And so, for example, our City line, we've had a number of companies operators rather, contact us, for example, the City line, and they've had the PSVAIR installed as part of the order. And so you can buy vehicles, obviously, with the installation. If they're a trusted supplier manufacturer, then you at least have that peace of mind and with any of the after sale support that you get. But we would say, depending on the vehicle capacity and the vehicle that you're having, we would do an assessment. But we've already got customers who are having the City line, which is a low floor minibus with up to 25 passengers, but a seating capacity of 16 or 18 that can have it installed on order. So yes, another officer, loads of really good questions. If I just scroll back up, so due diligence, and then what are the requirements for a successful? Oh, this is a good one as well. Given what we were saying, Andy, earlier, what are the requirements for a successful application strategies in place?
Successful application strategies. I'm not entirely sure. Understand what we're looking for.
I think some people. I think we were saying earlier, weren't we, that some people have submitted. I assume, I'm not sure if you want to add some more information, but so some people are applying, aren't they, for the exemptions, and some people are successfully getting the exemption, and some people aren't. I would assume that maybe that's what it relates to, because some people are getting refused and no one knows why.
If we're talking about PSVAR exemptions, the MT2 exemptions, we've had a number of operators who've contacted us saying that they've been refused the exemptions for basically no apparent reason. Feedback from DVSA has been pretty much zero. We're pursuing the matter with DFT at the moment, in the hope that there will be some route of appeal for this. It's particularly annoying because a lot of those who've been refused actually put applications in at a very early stage, in some cases before the guidance was issued, and haven't been notified until either literally right on the cusp of the window of application closing, or indeed after it's closed. So it didn't give them any opportunity then to submit a follow-up application that hopefully would correct any errors. But not knowing where the errors were in the first place is probably the most critical part of it all. We're liaising with other trade bodies who we know have got members in similar situations. Time is running short with it. We're only a few weeks away now from the schools going back, and there's operators out there, some of them with a substantial number of routes that they service, which currently they're unable to fulfill. I would certainly wouldn't want to be in the shoes of local authorities to have to find a significant number of vehicles at this particular late stage, should this not be reviewed. We're hopeful, as I say, that position will be reviewed. We're just waiting now to see what comes back from Department for Transport. It's disappointing that DVSA haven't engaged more with operators on this, I will say that.
I think that's just good to know that, Andy, that yourselves are fielding in feedback from operators and kind of collecting evidence, if you like, an example, so then you can lobby like the necessary parties to try and get these sorts of problems corrected, because otherwise you could be an operator on their own trying to get something fixed and wondering if anyone else is in the same shoes. So But another question is, what, with respect to the home to school paid services, if we do not hold the exemption, do we only need to have sufficient vehicles to cover the service and no more, i.e. one service and one vehicle?
If you need to use a specifically compliant vehicle on that service, so if you only need one vehicle to operate that one service, that's basically it. Whenever that service is operated, it has to be operated by a compliant vehicle. If you need a spare for it, then obviously you would need to.
And another one is, the problem with having stop information on emergency rail replacement, e.g. TfL contractors, is it takes time to get the displays programmed. Yes, we're getting that feedback, aren't we?
We certainly are.
So yes, you're right, that is a problem. And
that's something that we've raised with both Department for Transport and the Rail Delivery Group, and they are aware of it as a particular issue. Depending on the system itself, the complexity of how easy or difficult it is to actually program it. But certainly, if you're on a rail replacement standby, you've got no idea of where you might be going. You're waiting there to be called up, and to then have to try and program a system with it, that's certainly an issue.
So number one, in our fleet of 12 vehicles, only 5 fall within the regulations, as they are 35 to 53 seater coaches, one of which is full PSVAR compliant. We don't do RR service, only school and private hire work. If we get newer 2017 and if we get a newer 2017 coach 53 seat, can this be used as a backup, as we only have 9 operator discs which transfer to the backup coach? Would these 2017 reg coaches need to comply with PSVAR, please?
The data registration is only of any significance for another month or so for PSVAIR. In terms of actual registration date, it doesn't make any difference for PSVAIR.
Oh, so that's an extra whole tier of compliance, isn't it? It's a bit of a nightmare for everybody. So it seems that it sounds bad to say that, doesn't it? But it seems that if you're in a position where you have exemption options, then that's something to do with time is of the essence. If you can operate something under the basis of the exemptions whilst you look into other options. Gosh, we really did need this webinar, didn't we? We need a support group for this. That's what we need after this. I
will say with the industry as a whole has learnt an awful lot, but so has Department for Transport. I think their understanding, despite the efforts of ourselves and other trade bodies over the years, their understanding of how the industry operates, and particularly how it services home to school and rail replacement journeys, was very limited. And it's not as straightforward as some of our civil servant colleagues would like to think.
Definitely not. I worked in the public transport sector for a bit, and I know that well, nothing's straightforward when you're operating a fleet of vehicles that could go tech at any time, and there's roadworks. With no more questions, I will just say, there's another one. Oh yes, so with supply systems, so with different supply systems across vehicles, how will consistent passenger information be ensured, particularly on rail replacement services?
The requirement is to provide the same level of information across all systems and across all vehicle types. And to that end, I guess there's some merit in operators adopting some commonality and some standard with their particular supplier, so they're only using one particular source of information to program. So to that end, there's certainly some sense in that, but the requirements are quite specific on the PSVAIR in terms of what it has to provide. And as I say, certainly the vast majority of systems I think that we've kind of seen and had any experience of, they all seem to meet that particular requirement. You're on mute, Alex.
Thank you. So as this newer coach would take our 35 to 53 seat capacity to 6 coaches, regardless of operator license discs, we'd need to upgrade it to PSVAIR.
I think probably if that particular operator wants to get in touch with us, I'd probably talk this through in a bit more detail with them.
That would be good. I could barely read the question. I said, what week today? Thursday, Wednesday. Brilliant. So I think that is the end of the questions now. But yeah, as we said, we've recorded this, so we made available to people to watch back. I think I'll definitely watch it back just to completely understand the exemptions, and the seating capacity very valuable for us and for just me for general understanding. Thank you so much, Andy. I mean, I've researched this and I didn't even come close to understanding as much as you've just delivered in this session. And like you say, it is a lot to take on. So I think that's why it's great that we've got this recorded and we've got the PowerPoint slides with the URLs. And thanks to everyone who attended, and especially to those who asked questions as well at the end. It's much appreciated. And yeah, hopefully we will all be able to navigate this, all of us together, and everything will go seamlessly when the schools go back. Said nobody ever. But yeah, so yeah, thanks all for your time. Have a wonderful week and day. Enjoy the rain as it's finally here. And yeah, have a great day. Take care all.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.